Hello, Python Web Conference, and welcome back to day 3 of track 1. Actually, this is the keynote for day 3. I'm really excited. We've got Hayley Denbraver with us. She joined us last year, and I really enjoyed her talk. This year, she's got a new theme. It should be fun for everyone. If you have questions, don't hesitate to put them into the Slido or into the Slack channel. I'll capture them and ask them to Hayley at the end of her talk. And then we'll always have, of course, the face-to-face where if you want to talk to the speaker directly or the other attendees who are participating during this talk, we'll have that afterwards as well. And I will let Hayley take it away.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Just give me a second to share my screen and we'll be good to go. Let's see. So I'm going to assume that you can see that and we're going to kick it off. All right, so I want to open by saying, please don't panic. And I realize that by saying that, I may have made you panic. And it's one of those weird things. But please don't panic. If you need the slides, I have some. You can either find them on my Twitter account on the pinned tweet, and my username is up there at the top, or you can go to this link, and if that's helpful to you, that's awesome. All right, so who am I? I'm your tour guide today as we hitchhike through the galaxy and learn about some interesting problems. My name is Hayley. I'm a Python enthusiast. I'm a purveyor of weird conference talks, and I am currently looking for work. I have a really excellent dog, and I live in Seattle, which the guide describes as rainy, in the USA, which the guide describes as needing improvement, and on Earth, which has recently been deemed mostly harmless. So yeah, that's how we're going to start. And if you couldn't tell from my jokes on the previous slide, I'm going to be referencing Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you haven't read these books, haven't seen the movie, please don't worry. The book is delightfully absurd, but it doesn't have a ton of plot, and it can largely be ignored. It's okay. The TLDR is that an average British man, invariably played by Martin Freeman, survives the destruction of Earth, and he travels the galaxy with his friend Ford Prefect, and he tries not to lose his towel or insult mice. And the eponymous Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a Wikipedia-like trove of information that can help you understand almost anything you would encounter on your travels. And so I want to start off with this cold water in your face, okay? I regret to inform you that there are problems that you are currently overlooking. I realize it might be surprising, but it's undoubtedly true. But Hayley, you say, I don't see any problem or danger, and that is precisely the point. And we're going to go to the Hitchhiker's Guide to learn a little bit more about why that might be. So let me introduce you to the idea, the concept of a somebody else's problem field. An SEP field is a simple but devastating technology. And here's how it's described in Adams's book. An SEP is something we can't see or we don't see. It's something our brain doesn't let us see because we think that it is somebody else's problem. That's what SEP means, somebody else's problem. The brain just edits it out. It's like a blind spot. If you look directly at it, you won't see it unless you know precisely what it is. Your only hope is to catch it by surprise out of the corner of your eye. And that's what we're going to try to learn to do. So to continue, the somebody else's problem field is simple and effective. And what's more, it can be run for over 100 years on a single torch, that's flashlight for fellow Americans, battery. This is because it relies on people's natural disposition not to see anything they don't want to, weren't expecting, and can't explain. And this is from Douglas Adams' Life, the Universe, and Everything, which is one of the sequels to the Hitchhiker's Guide. Now, in the book, this is quite literally like a force field. Like if you think of a spaceship and they have like a protective shield, that kind of thing. The idea is that You cast this SEP field over something and it's protected, and people will walk by it, over it, through it, and never know what's there. And, even though that's science fiction, this is really a common thing in our lives as developers and our life in technology, right? And I want to say from the first that I believe that there are two types of these problems. SEP fields can be naturally occurring, and this is because we have a limited viewpoint and life experience. And there are always going to be times where we're unaware of a problem just because we can't see it from our viewpoint. And in this case, we want to be willing to listen to others and learn and seek out resources that can help you understand and then see the problem out of the corner of your eye. But sometimes an SEP field can be carefully constructed and deliberately deployed to obscure. People and systems who do this want you to ignore a problem because doing so protects their position, is financially expedient, or at least they think it is, or just something along those lines. And so 4 things I want to discuss today that you may have decided is not your division. Maybe it's not on your radar. Maybe you catch a little glimpse of it, but then it's gone. And the 4 things are security, accessibility, documentation and testing, and inclusion. And we won't have time to get into all these ways that it might manifest, but hopefully we can learn to think of these things in a different way. So to start with security, if we're considering security, the first question that might come up is, wait, Hayley, we have a security team at my company. This is literally somebody else's problem. And yeah, hopefully you do have a security team. Regardless, many security problems are introduced in the code, and as a software team, you own the code. Security is the security team's problem, but it's yours too, and we're working toward the same goal. Now, to further obscure this and to add an additional layer that might prevent you from seeing security as your problem, when we think about security, not only is it somebody else's problem, perhaps, but you are literally using somebody else's Python. And this was something I hadn't really thought about until a few years ago. Open source is amazing, period, full stop. It's great. Don't get me wrong. But if you approach open source as a consumer rather than as a steward of the software, you can run into problems, and those can include security problems. When you use a project, you inherit all the functionality, but you also inherit any problems associated with it. And no code is perfect. So you want to ask yourself, do you know of security problems in your libraries? It may be somebody else's Python in that somebody else wrote and maintains it. But if you are running it in production, then you are responsible for its use and its impact on your project. Now, security is multifaceted, and we have security professionals for a reason. But if you want to get used to thinking in a more secure way and securing your software, these are a few steps that might help. So first, break down the silos between security and development so that you collectively own your progress and your goals and things like that. The more talk between these two departments, the better as far as getting your security up and scaled and that sort of thing. I would also recommend automating whenever you can. There are tons of options for building security into your workflow, and I have a few linked at the end. Third, I would say to just ask your security person what you can do and what they wish you knew. I think generally people are delighted to find out that you want to learn more about what they're doing and about how to help them out. And so that's a really good resource if you have that available in your office. I would say it's worth learning the basics, including the OWASP top 10. And again, more links at the end. And just throughout all these, take your friends with you. When you learn something new, share it with a colleague and spread the knowledge around. All right. So the second topic that I wanted to discuss is accessibility. And to open this section, we want to discuss what is accessibility, because maybe it isn't something that has crossed your path too often. I know a lot of us are working in the back end, and you might consider it a front end thing, but it's worth understanding as a whole. So this is some information from the Mozilla Web Docs, and this is how they describe accessibility. When someone describes a site as accessible, they mean that any user can use all its features and content regardless of how the user accesses the web, even and especially users with physical or mental impairments. So this means that sites should be accessible via keyboard, mouse, and touchscreen. Any other way that users access the web. This includes screen readers and voice assistants like Google Home. All right. Additionally, applications should be understandable and usable by people regardless of auditory, visual, physical, or cognitive abilities. And sites should not cause harm. Certain web features like motion can cause migraines or epileptic seizures, and they can be a real problem, and you want to avoid it. So that's like the groundwork for accessibility. This is our definition. And why might accessibility be behind this SEP field? Why might you think it's not your problem? And I personally believe that accessibility falls into this somebody else's problem idea by what I like to call works on my machine writ large. Works on my machine is something that we've probably all said at some point, but it really isn't an acceptable end to a discussion on why code is crashing elsewhere, why it's not working in production, things like that. It's not something you can end a conversation with. It doesn't matter if it works on your machine in real life, or if in real life, in the wild, in production, everything has gone to hell. Doesn't matter that it works for you. When you ignore accessibility concerns, this implicitly includes a works on my machine. But instead of computers, we're talking about how people interact with your work. Works on my machine isn't good enough for computers, so why should we allow it with people? If you are saying, I can see it, I can hear it, I'm not bothered by the flashing graphic, I can use the website intuitively and easily, it's great that it works on your machine, but it isn't enough. And accessibility is not somebody else's problem because life can come at you really fast. Accessibility is your problem because whether now or in the future, there's a chance that you personally will need it. And if you ask me how I can be so sure of that, it's because that's what happened to me. Accessibility is for me. In April of 2019, so almost 2 years ago, I was up late working, and suddenly it felt like there was a cotton ball in my ear, and my ear started to ring really loudly. Now, I think everyone has experienced ear ringing. It's not all that weird, and I wasn't all that worried about it at first. But the thing is that it hasn't stopped ringing ever since, 2 years in. And it probably won't ever. I was eventually diagnosed with something called Meniere's disease. I've lost a fair amount of hearing in that ear, and I'm likely to lose all of it, at least over here, and who knows on the other ear. I tell you this because I need accommodations today that I did not consider before they happened to me. And that was a really terrible feeling. Accessibility seemed like somebody else's problem, but it doesn't seem like that anymore. Currently, I use a hearing aid, and it helps a lot with the tinnitus and with parsing people's speech. Most days, people would never know that I struggle. And, some days is harder than others because I'm tired or someone has an accent or, who knows. But it took experiencing the hearing loss myself to understand the importance of things like captioning. It was honestly embarrassing to come to the realization. And I wish I had been able to put myself in someone's shoes and had sought out resources to better understand this before getting a nice swift kick to the face by reality, right? And that is one strong reason that I really want you to understand that this isn't somebody else's problem. This could be future you. This could be people you know and care for, and they're people regardless. And that makes accessibility really important. And I have two more thoughts on accessibility. And the first is that accessibility should be part of the minimum viable product. And, some people bristle at this a little bit. They think maybe they can put it on the roadmap, and they're not quite sure why right away they need to do this. And the answer is that if you're not doing this initially, you are explicitly telling people that you don't care about their experience with your product. Here are two recent cases that have been discussed a bit in the news. First off is Zoom. Zoom had options for captioning. For example, you could designate a participant to provide captions, usually a paid transcriptor, but their automatic captions were only included for their paid users. And this is a really bad look. Accessibility features shouldn't be behind a paywall. If there's an accessibility feature that's behind a paywall and you have a free tier, it should really be part of the free tier too. Competitors like Google did not have this behind a paywall, and it made Zoom look really bad. Zoom has reversed their decision, and they will be rolling out their auto captioning to all of their users by this fall. But there's still some concerns in the community about who gets to enable captions, how they work. Do you have to disclose to the owner of the meeting, et cetera, et cetera. So there's still some questions, right? But if they had thought of this from the first, then you wouldn't get this back and forth and this dialogue about this really sticky issue. Another case recently involves Clubhouse, which is a new social media app that is a drop-in audio chat. And they've gotten a lot of bad press. Some of it is that it's fairly exclusive. You have to get an invite, and they haven't rolled it out largely yet. But some of it is that they're getting bad press for being super inaccessible to not only the deaf and hard of hearing community with no live captioning, et cetera, but that they also have issues for people with visual impairments. Low contrast, they're not accessible by screen readers, et cetera. The earlier you get started on stuff like this, I imagine that Clubhouse will probably adopt some of these things to make it a little more friendly, but that standard, or they've already sent a message, right, to their community and to the people using their product, things like that. If you get started on this earlier, it's better. It's the right thing to do, but in case you need some more motivation, a lack of accessibility can exclude you from profits. A lot of disability is invisible, so there is a larger market for this than you think. You may think you don't know any disabled people, but I assure you, you're wrong. and you don't want to cut yourself out of that market. Additionally, you could get bad press. So that's further motivation to not do it. And there are legal risks. Target, Domino's, and Netflix have all suffered legal repercussions for not complying with web content access guidelines. And there were over 3,500 lawsuits, not just letters of demand, not just notices, things like that, for accessibility in 2020. And when people sue for this, they're not suing for money. You don't get money for suing under ADA. You are suing for access. That's all people want. Now, the second thought I have about accessibility is what I would call the elephant in the room. And I would ask you, how is your life different today than it was just over a year ago? Are your day-to-day activities different? Are you working from home? Do you telecommute? What has changed in your life? And I'm going to reckon that it's a lot. COVID has taught us many things, but among disabled people, things that we had been told weren't possible, that weren't strategic, weren't useful, these things started to happen in COVID. Working remotely, flexible schedules, virtual events, telemedicine, certain delivery and pickup options, etc. Suddenly these things that had been, oh, that's too much of a hassle, became doable because we had to. But the truth is that there are people out there who had to already before this pandemic. And so I would say that it's really nice that we're making progress on vaccinations and that a more normal summer and fall is possible this year, although not certain. But it's my hope that we remember some of the ways that we adapted during this crisis and keep them moving forward as options. You know, right now it's kind of obligation because we all need to keep numbers low, not get sick, et cetera. But I want to keep this as an option as things move forward. So, what are some steps towards a more accessible future? First, learn how to use alt text and captions on your social media. There are great resources for this. It's really not that hard. And you can be super helpful with someone or to someone with vision impairments or auditory or processing issues. Second, I would say that it's really important to check your projects for accessibility issues and that there are easy ways to do this. There's some links at the end for sites that you can go to learn more. Third, I would say, if your company is sponsoring a conference and you have their ear, maybe consider sponsoring live captioning or ASL explicitly. This is a really easy and cool thing to do and something I'd really love to see at conferences in the future. Fourth, I would say to ask questions at early stages of product development. And fifth, it kind of goes in with this, but ask who isn't in the room. If, you know, a lot of people, they don't have bad intentions, but they don't know to ask the questions. They don't know what questions to ask, etc. And so if we expand the pool of people we're talking to, you're going to get better feedback on ways to be open and useful to the largest section of the community that you possibly can. All right. So the third somebody else's problem field that you may come across is testing and documentation. So what about it? Testing can seem like someone else's problem because at the time you are thinking about writing a test or documenting some code, everything might be working. The code you wrote seems obvious, it doesn't have any apparent side effects, etc. So, you know, why take that extra time? And The truth is, when you do this, when you ignore the testing and the documenting and that kind of thing, you are post-dating your problems to yourself. By not testing, you are simply creating a mess for yourself later. Something that seems reasonable or easy now may have lost context in a month, and no one else lives in your head. So you may be causing a teammate problems too. I would say to this, pretend you're a time traveler. Pretend that you're a time traveler from the future, and that you are here to write a task that will prevent a major headache or a giant problem later, and the citizens of Gotham will thank you. And just set yourself up for success. Set your team up for success. In addition to saving yourself the headache, you just have a more resilient, a better project. And when I think about setting yourself up for success, my brain goes to my dog, Nessa. She is really good. She's a very good girl. But when we first got her, she was a problem child. And we realized that we weren't doing her any favors. And that we needed to figure out how to help her be a good dog. Basically, we needed to set her up for success. We now have clear boundaries and consistencies, and we remove obstacles and temptations for her. And suddenly, under the structure and playing by these rules, she is an excellent dog. And it may seem obvious, but it was really the best thing we could do for her. And, she breaks the rules. Sometimes she's not perfect. The other day, she saw an opportunity to eat a meat pie, and she took it. But that structure, because that structure was there, she knew it was wrong. And she ended up kenneling herself, So even in that moment of failure, those boundaries are useful to learn and to improve, right? And testing and documentation can provide that kind of structure for your team. It can help keep your project on the rails. It can help yourself and your team members act in their best interests. And it's just great to work from a shared set of facts and to know your stuff is working. So here's some advice on how to keep your code documented, things like that. So the final SEP that I want to discuss is inclusion. And you probably have heard a lot about diversity, but the final SEP field today is not diversity, but inclusion. Diversity is about the makeup of your team. Inclusion is about the team culture and about how psychologically safe and how welcome people feel, especially people who are not in the majority. Inclusion is about participation and being heard and thriving. Inclusion can seem like a somebody else's problem because we generally think of everyone being responsible for their own interpersonal interactions. Americans are really idealistic, they're individualistic, and that's a quality that can be great, but it can trip us up as well. And this individualistic approach is not necessarily the healthiest for your team. And it can leave people feeling excluded, and it can leave your project open to risk. There's a myth of a 10x individual, but by and large, software is written collectively, and the team can be greater than the sum of its parts if we're thoughtful and considerate about it. And so I asked myself a few questions about this topic. And the first is, what does it mean to contribute? If we're thinking about our software team, how do people contribute? Coding is essential, obviously, that's our job. But is there essential work that is not noticed or less noticed? And this could include things like reviewing code, being on call, interviewing, onboarding team members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the next question to this is, what is rewarded? Sometimes we reward things that are easy to track because, if you can measure this thing, then you're able to rank people or you have some concrete evidence. But just because something is measurable doesn't mean that it is the correct or valuable thing to be rewarding upon. So we need to think about all those tasks that are important to a software team and approach how we reward people in light of all of that. Are you promoting and paying people with a holistic view of what they contribute to the team? If you aren't, what potential are you missing out on? How do you hire? This is a similar thing, right? Are you open to people without CS degrees? If a job is posted, how do you reach people outside your immediate circle? Is your hiring process exclusionary? Do you have to jump through too many hoops and, do this whole 3-ring circus, and it weeds out people who don't have that much outside of work time? Privileged people can usually put up with the BS that is our hiring process, but good candidates can't always do that. And so we should really think about how we hire, why we hire, and who we're talking to. And there's 2 more questions I ask with respect to inclusion. And one is, how do I respond to toxicity in my team? And do I have a plan in place to prioritize the marginalized people on the team? It's really common in conferences, things like that, to have a code of conduct. But does your team have something like that? Or do you have some rules of engagement for your team? Do the people on your team know that? Have a plan for how to respond to problems, because we're people, we're infallible, or we have problems, it's going to come up. But if you know how to respond and want to protect and prioritize people who are vulnerable, then you're going to be ahead of the game. And part of understanding this is asking ourselves who we're listening to. Does your media diet, whether it's social or otherwise, social media, what does it look like? Do you read the work of people of color, Black women, disabled people, LGBTQ people, people outside your country? If you expose yourself to the voices of people unlike you, you have the ability to add strength to your team and perspective, and to welcome people in the way that will be most welcoming to them. And so this is something I'd encourage you to do. And, there's this final question of why. Why do I want us to think about inclusion? And it's really hard to build a diverse, inclusive team with a good dynamic. But I personally think it's really, really worth it. And that's because by hiring and retaining people who aren't just like you, you have a way, your team has a way to pull against the SEP field, because you have more perspective, and maybe you can't see it out the corner of your eye, but your friend can. And there's actually some really interesting reading that you can do on this topic about why inclusion matters. The first book here is Invisible Women, and it's about data bias in the world designed for men. So this includes stories about how airbags weren't built for an average woman's frame. And therefore, were not as helpful in getting people to, or getting women to survive impacts, things like that. And then weapons of mass destruction talks about algorithmic bias. And this is basically like a team has written some software and they think, well, this is automated. The computer isn't racist, right? Well, yeah, the computer is racist because you are priming this algorithm with data and with all this history from our racist world, right? So if you have a team that is more diverse, you're going to catch issues like that. And you'll do it faster. You can do it internally, and this won't roll out into production. And those are both books that I really recommend. All right. So what now? We've discussed 4 things that are sometimes behind somebody else's problem fields: security, accessibility, testing in docs, and inclusion. So how do we work towards ownership of these issues? How do we work towards progress? I have a few ideas, but I hope that you will spend some time thinking of more later today. So the first idea, which is probably best for security and for testing, is automation. If you're automating something, your baseline is healthier. This doesn't mean that you have no other work to do, that you shouldn't dig into some of the fundamentals, but it at least means that there is something consistent going on to address the health of your test suite or your security positioning. And the good news is that there are a lot of options that you can use to bring some automation into these areas. And another thing that can help you with your SEP fields is getting expert advice, opinions, and help. Recognizing and acting upon an SEP field doesn't mean that you have to be responsible for everything. It's about being aware of the issue and addressing it. And that can be through getting advice, getting an expert, things like that. That is addressing it. Additionally, I think cooperation is extremely important. It's worth knowing that seeing past this SEP field does not mean that it suddenly becomes my problem. It doesn't suddenly become your problem. It becomes our challenge and our problem together. And that makes it a lot less scary to think about these topics that we would like to think aren't our division, that kind of thing. And it seems weird and hard to think of your project and your team holistically. It's really easy to do what you've always been doing and to not push yourself in these ways. But when we confront challenges, even ones we would rather not see, our teams and our projects become more resilient, more flexible, more adaptable. You're able to respond to things faster. And that is pretty amazing, even if it isn't the answer to life, the universe, and everything. So I just wanted to say thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Feel free to say hi in the Slack channel or on Twitter. I'm Hayley Denbraver on Twitter. And I want to thank the Python Web Conference organizers and the excellent sponsors. I really appreciate it. Additionally, you can find the slides here, tinyurl.com, Python Don't Panic. And at the very end of the slides, I have tons and tons of links for things that I read in preparation for this and just things that I think might be helpful for you as you go on your journey through the galaxy. And I really appreciate you all being here today. Thanks.